Hi, so this is my third video talking about Return to Oz, one of those unusual films that's targeted at kids, but it's surprisingly fascinating to watch and reflect upon as a kid who grew up as an adult. In this video, I want to talk about one of the core thematic elements of the movie, perhaps the one theme that cries out to be interpreted more than any other part of the movie. I'm referring here to the meaning of the hospital, and especially Dr. Worley, that friendly but dangerous character who one could argue is really the primary villain of the story, even though he is the least frightening villain in the story, from a child's point of view, at least. So for this video, I'll be asking the question, what is the hospital and what does it represent from history or from metaphor, or both? And then who is and what is Dr. Worley, and what does he represent from history or from metaphor, or both? I'll also be tying in a little bit of discussion about the character of the Gnome King that comes in near the end of the story, since you can't really do a complete discussion of Dr. Worley without discussing the Gnome King. First off, let's take a look at how Dr. Worley is presented, beginning with the first reference to him in the film. The first reference is that newspaper clipping that Uncle Henry picks up. And back in the year 1900, when there isn't any internet, a piece of paper goes a long way. Uncle Henry, as he picks it up and looks at it, clearly he's looked at this clipping a number of times and kept it around. Because back in the year 1900, when this movie takes place, if all you've got is a piece of paper, this little clipping, then all you've got is a piece of paper. You're not going to go Google anything. Now, we are allowed to take a glance at it. And while I'm assuming the filmmakers really didn't intend us to go and read every word that appeared on the screen, we might as well. We might as well freeze the screen and do so. So what have we got here? Announcement, electric healing, Weltmer method. I take pleasure in saying to the citizens of Black River Falls, oh, that sounds pleasant, and adjacent towns and surrounding country that I have secured Dr. J.B. Worley, Graduate American School, Electric Healing. And I've opened a school and sanitarium of electric healing at my residence, Lower Falls, town of Brockway, where the afflicted may exchange their aches and pains for ease and comfort. Those wishing to acquire this method may take, blah, 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 and demonstrator's course, blah, 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 experienced and successful, and then whatever else might be on that page. So what can we figure out from this? As far as I can tell, there's no such thing in the real world, that is, there's no such thing as a real life American School of Electric Healing from this time period or any other time, at least nothing that Google could bring up for me. But I do think it's kind of interesting just thinking about the fact that in 1900, anything with electric in the name would definitely have, seems to me, would have sounded pretty plausible to a normal person, because with the electric light gradually coming into common use, as the film references, electricity was new and kind of magical. And from a common person's point of view, there'd be no telling what other kind of magical things electricity might be able to do. So who would have thought it implausible to suggest that there might be something like electric healing? You know, if electricity has already been able to do such unexpected, such remarkable things. Now, when I was putting this together, my curiosity was kind of struck when I saw that curious little clue in parentheses there, Weltmer method, and I thought I would look it up. And I think it's a tiny little kind of a playful clue that the production team left for us in terms of what kind of ideas may have been running through their heads as they put this film together. So far as I can tell, there's never a Weltmer method of electric healing, but there was a Weltmer School of Healing, launched in 1887, later renamed the Weltmer Institute of Suggestive Therapeutics. Weltmerism was apparently a pseudoscientific approach to healing that was started by Sidney Weltmer and involved the use of magnetism, hypnosis, mental suggestion, and telepathy to bring about healing. Well, there's not a lot of information about Weltmerism outside of small historical websites and an article on Wikipedia. You can find private websites with scans of postcards connected with the Weltmer School and Sanitarium. And on various websites, you can download or purchase some of Sidney Weltmer's books, such as The Mystery Revealed, or The Handbook of Weltmerism, a supplement to the author's new and illustrated mail course of instruction in his science of healing, published in 1901. Or here's another one, the Weltmer School of Healing's own publication called The Discovery of Weltmerism, which serves as an extended advertisement for the Weltmerite treatment. It appears that one of the inspirations for Dr. Worley's hospital may have been this pseudoscientific pretentiousness that we see reflected in the Weltmer School. But on the other hand, Dr. Worley's hospital contains no references to the kinds of immediately suspicious concepts such as animal magnetism, telepathic remote healing, or any of the other specific emphases of Weltmerism. So I think it'd be safe to say that the writers were inspired by the idea of Weltmerism and included the reference on the clipping as kind of an inside joke, but I think they don't intend to portray Dr. Worley as actually being a follower of Weltmer in that literal sense. Whereas Weltmerism was an extrinsically suspicious-looking movement that took a lot of cues from the Christian Science cult from the same century, Dr. Worley's hospital, on the other hand, puts on the respectable front of being focused on physical brain function and cutting-edge electrical technology, apart from any references to alleged parapsychological phenomena like animal magnetism and telepathy. More importantly, I would be very surprised if any of Weltmer's patients ended up with permanent brain damage as a result of his remote telepathic healing procedures. So that's all, you just kind of a little bit of a tangent based on that one word in the newspaper clipping, which I think the producers probably intended as a bit of an inside joke that most people would never notice. But how are Worley and the hospital presented to us in the clear scenes of the movie? Well, it seems like there are four primary scenes that give us a portrait of Worley and his hospital. First, Dr. Worley's discussion with Dorothy. Second, Dr. Worley explaining the machine and the treatment to Aunt Em. Third, that short little reveal from Ozma as they flee. And fourth, the mysterious epilogue. So first there, in Dr. Worley's discussion with Dorothy, he patronizingly and condescendingly challenges her memories of Oz. Very memorable scene there. Second, when he explains the science of it to Aunt Em, and here's a quote: "The brain itself is an electrical machine. It's nothing but a machine. When it malfunctions, a blow to the head, for example, the brain produces useless excess currents. And these excess currents are our dreams and delusions. And wouldn't you know," and then at that point, the voice becomes inaudible, trails off as the music takes over. And this is when Dorothy sees Ozma in the mirror. But in the greater conversation there, Worley's emphasis in the conversation is that it's because of this new age of electricity, this, quote, electrical marvel, that will be able to, quote, get rid of all those bad waking dreams you've been telling me about, as he said to Dorothy. So those are the first two I mentioned. The third important moment is when Ozma is releasing Dorothy from that, the operating table. And Dorothy asks about the screams, and Ozma explains, "It's patients they damaged, locked in the cellar." So this is an important reveal. It's so quick you can almost miss it, but it's important because it seems that whatever this electric treatment is supposed to be, apparently, whatever it is, it has a high risk for causing something like some kind of brain damage, some kind of insanity, that kind of thing. And then finally, the fourth important moment for understanding how Worley is portrayed in the film, not including the Gnome King scenes. But this fourth one is at the end of the film, after everything's over, when Aunt Em tells Dorothy what happened to Dr. Worley. She says, "The clinic was hit by lightning and it burned to the ground. Everybody was rescued except Dr. Worley. He ran in to rescue his machines." But what Aunt Em doesn't explain to Dorothy is why the head nurse is being driven away to go to jail, which makes you immediately wonder, at least it makes you wonder if you're an adult. As a kid, it just went over my head, but it makes you wonder as an adult, did the clinic burn down, or did Dr. Worley burn it down himself to avoid prosecution for abusive medical experimentation? Well, it's such a comforting line to hear at the end of the movie. Dr. Worley and all his scary stuff in the hospital, they're all gone. Hooray! It's very comforting, especially if you're a little spooked by the story as a kid. But it's also a very mysterious line that, if you're thinking a little, it might leave you wondering what on earth actually happened. Not to mention also creating a little bit of a spooky feeling when you realize that both Worley and the Gnome King both disappeared with these great walls of flame, and there's no good reason, since it couldn't be a dream, it just kind of gives you that spooky, this doesn't make sense why things were, there's so much correlation. And then the discussion won't be complete until we do finally talk about the Gnome King and how he connects with Dr. Worley. But before we get there, I think it's high time we ask the question, so what is this electric device all about? Since it's clearly, at this point, losing any amount of parallels to Weltmer's hypnotic healing. I think the Weltmer connection is simply the fact that it's a pseudoscientific sham. But that's about where the connection stops, because Dr. Worley, in contrast, is a skeptical-minded person who paints a compelling but dishonest story of groundbreaking medical practice rooted in physical science with no nonsense about telepathy or other spiritualistic stuff. But once he performs his groundbreaking medical practice on a patient, that patient may in fact suffer permanent brain damage. Clearly, the writers have more in mind than mere nonsensical, spurious mental healing practices. A lot of the time, people assume that Worley must be practicing electroshock therapy of some kind. But electroshock wasn't developed until 1938. Remember, this story takes place in 1900. And further, electroshock isn't likely to cause brain damage or have other strong negative effects, at least not as practiced today, as far as I can tell. I wonder if a better parallel to what the film describes might be the practice of lobotomy, a medical practice that dates back to the 30s and includes, this is a quote from WebMD, includes removing some brain tissue and severing the connections between the frontal lobe and the thalamus. And its proponents championed it as a miracle cure for mental health disorders ranging from depression to schizophrenia, and they often misrepresented its statistical viability. They underrepresented the risk factors, so people didn't know how much risk there was. According to healthline.com, one of the highest profile cases of a failed lobotomy was that of Rosemary Kennedy, younger sister of John F. Kennedy. After undergoing a lobotomy in 1941 to treat seizures and extreme shifts in mood, she lost her ability to walk or talk. Her personality was permanently altered, and she was left with physical disability. That seems more the ballpark we're talking about. And then, apparently, ever since 1975, apparently it was with the 1975 film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I still haven't seen at this point. But apparently they really put electroshock and lobotomy together in popular awareness as being two abusive medical practices that can be inflicted upon the mentally ill. So in the film, apparently, both electroshock and lobotomy were both used in an unethical manner to deal with problem patients. And the film concludes with one of the main characters being subjected to permanent brain damage through lobotomy as part of a power play by the head nurse. So, could be suggested that the filmmakers intend to combine these three concepts together. We've got the idea of a dubious medical establishment like the Weltmer School, except what they're practicing is something like lobotomy that has a high risk of destroying its patients. Except, since lobotomy would make the film would make it rated R instantly, they make it more akin to electroshock therapy in terms of what it looks like. Except this is 30 years earlier than either electroshock or lobotomy. So it seems like all three ideas are kind of thrown together. The end result is that they portray something that never happened literally, that is. But in terms of the spirit of it, it's the kind of thing that has happened throughout the world at various times in history. Perhaps you could say that, take it a step further, maybe you could say that it's really describing medical experimentation on the one hand, such as the kind that was recently found to have happened in Nazi Germany in some pretty grotesque ways. And at the same time, maybe it's also describing the great medical mistakes that have happened, such as the practice of lobotomy. But in the case of Dr. Worley's clinic, it's not a simple case of well-intentioned doctors promoting a practice based on skewed statistics. It seems to be more a case of clearly deceptive and abusive malpractice, presumably done to advance science through human experimentation and therefore boost the prestige of, in this case, Dr. Worley. I realize now that last thing I said might seem like a bit of a jump of logic, but let's think about the Gnome King a little bit, and maybe you'll see why I jump in that direction. So if you remember, the Gnome King acted likable and safe, just like Dr. Worley, but he lied about his intentions and how much harm his actions would cause to his patients or to his victims, just like Dr. Worley. And in the final moments, if you'll remember, here's basically how it went. Every instance in which the Gnome King's deceptive transaction, with sending them into his palace to find to try to find the right ornaments. Every instance in which that transaction took place and the victim was lost, the Gnome King became just a little more, he shrunk down a little bit and became just a little more human. Just a little more, you could say, a little more likable, a little more normal, a little more soft and relatable, until he was almost indistinguishable from a human person. And I would suggest, it seems to me, the point of that exchange is that the Gnome King served to benefit from every moment of loss that Dorothy and the other victims experienced. It wasn't, in fact, merely a whim on his part, but it was a calculated source of gain to make the Gnome King more human in the best kinds of ways. The losses of others were his immediate gain, not to give him more power or more size in the most extrinsic sense, but to give him more humanness and more realness. So I might suggest, maybe, it seems to me, this is a colorful metaphor for the abusive researcher, or for that matter, it's a colorful metaphor for any abuser with power who uses deceit in order to destroy others while simultaneously polishing his public and professional image. In fact, building his humanness and his realness, literally building that on the bones of his victims. That's what the Gnome King was doing. That's what Dr. Worley was doing. And that's the kind of thing that happens in general when the power of an individual is greater than his ethical centeredness. It results in a person who is willing to destroy others to aggrandize himself. A very similar theme appeared in the book series, in book 2 of the Oz series, which was published in, I think, 1903, 1904, something like that. The Marvelous Land of Oz. This happened when it was discovered that Oz had actually stolen the throne from the good King Pastoria, and then in order to cover up his deception, he sold the king's daughter and the rightful heir to the throne, sold her to the local hag Mombi. So in that story, it was discovered that Oz was the abusive leader, the holder of power who aggrandizes himself by destroying others and taking their own qualities for his own. He made himself great and he made himself good by destroying good King Pastoria and by selling Ozma to the witch and her abusive clutches. Basically, he built his empire on the bones of his victims. In Return to Oz in 1985, that same character profile with some changes is instead transferred to Dr. Worley and the Gnome King, two other characters who in other ways seek to aggrandize themselves while destroying others, seek to build their own apparent goodness on the bones of those they destroy. So wrapping up toward an end, we could ask, what does Worley and his hospital represent in the end? Well, maybe it represents abusive leaders who deceive others to aggrandize themselves. Or maybe it represents unethical establishments that offer more than they can actually offer to take advantage of the vulnerable. You could think of the hospital and Dr. Worley as representing the darkest parts of accepted society, the parts where abuse happens under our noses because it's part of a system that's recognized and respected. It could be thought of as representing systems that are so hopelessly corrupt that they require victims to form the fuel and resources on which the system can develop and grow. In that sense, you could say Dr. Worley and his hospital represent the Gnome King, building beautiful things on top of the carcasses in the Emerald City. Or you could go more loosely and just say that Worley and the hospital just represent, like Oz did in book 2 of the series, they represent the leader who's willing to crush and destroy others in order to aggrandize himself. The particulars may change, but the thrust remains the same. It's the guy you thought you could trust, the guy whose motives were so different than the ones you thought you saw. Next up in the series, I'll be talking about the character of Ozma, particularly in the first and last portions of the film.